Welcome everybody to another episode of the Project Cambridge Show. I'm here today with the wonderful Dr David Cleevely CBE. Thank you for joining us.
Great to see you, Jo. And
we've had a bit of a journey to get here. Maybe I'll tell you about it in another episode one day. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, David.
We made it in the end.
We made it in the end. But this is what I'm hoping is going to be a wonderful interview. And thank you very much for inviting me to your lovely home in Cambridge. We're enjoying the beautiful March sunshine actually, coming into David's pavilion in the garden. I don't know if you can see on screen, we're here also with Munslow, who's David's beautiful Labradoodle, isn't he?
Labradoodle, yeah.
Labradoodle.
Nice, yeah.
So Munslow does like to get involved, so you might see him on the camera from time to time. But anyway, we've got a lot to talk about today. So what I'd like to do, first of all, if that's all right with you, David, is just to talk about your early life, you know, where life started for you and until you were about this kind of size, you know, what was life like?
Well, I mean, some of it I've been told about by my parents, what life was like. But I was born in Germany because my father was stationed out in with the RAF, and I was actually born in an RAF hospital in Rinteln, near Hanover. And then when my mum was, mum was not very well in the first couple of years. So basically, my first language turned out to be German. Although when I came to England, it kind of faded. Which, apart from sometimes occasionally finding German a kind of natural language structure with the verbs at the end, I find why don't everybody speak like that? and secondly, just finding German a kind of natural kind of way to think about languages. So having picked it up at O level, but not doing terribly well at it, to be honest. Anyway, so came back to the UK, and my parents had a little flat in southwest London, which is where my earliest memories are from. Yeah.
So you know, southwest London, East Sheen, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, they had a little flat on Richmond Hill, actually, on the road leading up to the park. Where my grandparents had a big house which they let out, and they let the basement out to my parents for a few months. And I remember climbing up the steps out of the basement with my Christmas present. Must have been Christmas present, I think, because we'd already arrived by the time I was 2. So I'd be 2 1/4 or so, climbing up to show my grandparents the toys that I got for my Christmas.
So little David, young David, already kind of curious about the world and how things work and science, found worms, didn't you, David? Tell us about worms.
I don't know, how old would I have been? 3, perhaps. And there was a worm there. So this would have been, I could probably date it. I was probably not quite 3, actually. And there was a worm sitting on the concrete path, as it happens, and I kind of picked it up and wondered what was inside. So I picked it up and bit it.
As you do.
Well, you know, I was wondering, and some blood came out. So I then remember thinking, I wonder if there's more blood in this worm. So I kept biting it until the blood stopped. And then I thought, well, you know, there's only a certain amount of blood in the worm. There must be just that much blood in the worm. And so then I put it down, and that was it. It was an instructive lesson. My first proper experiment in biology, I suppose.
There you go. This is David's introduction to science, all the way back when he was about 3 years old. So you went to school locally in the area, didn't you?
Yes, I went to the local primary school. That's right.
And I think you showed signs of entrepreneurship very early on in life, didn't you? And that was kind of formed around beekeeping, wasn't it?
I went to the local grammar school, and I did a whole load of things at that grammar school. Actually, looking back on it, it's a bit like, I don't know, watching the History Boys or something like that. You realise how good an education it was and what people did. But on the beekeeping side, I was probably about 15 or so, and I'd read a book that my parents had from the 1930s, my mother, I think, and it was, an intelligent child could, with £5, could set up their own beekeeping and could keep bees. And I thought, well, let's see how I can do that. It would cost rather more than that, in fact. My parents wouldn't let me keep bees at home.
Not surprised?
Well, I mean, these are all right. I don't know what people worry about. And so I set up a beekeeping club at school, and then literally, in those days, beekeeping was a lot easier than it is now. Now it's very difficult, but then it was a lot easier, and I was able to make enough money off the honey that the bees had collected and processed for me, and sell those to the Parent Teachers Association, all the parents at the school, to pay for the cost of the hives.
So all of your investment in the beekeeping equipment all paid off, and you made a tidy profit. Yes,
but it also brought me in touch with somebody at the National Physical Laboratory, a chap called George, whose second name escapes me, last name escapes me, but he was a very nice chap. And I bumped into him because for some reason I'd managed to get a couple of days at the NPL at their open days and seen what was going on. And got introduced to all sorts of weird things. There was a screen which showed you what it would be like driving down a road as you approached the speed of light, and what would happen to the telegraph poles as you. I discovered it actually online recently. It's still there. You can find it on YouTube if you want. And there was a teletype there which taught you maths. So it would give you maths questions and you would answer. Of course, in those days, this really was a teletype. I mean, it was literally a roll of paper coming over. Yeah. You were connected to a computer. But it was one of the early examples of trying to use computers to do education. So there I am, 15, 16 years old, getting exposed to this kind of stuff. But there were bees there, and I thought, well, I'll ask this chap if he could help me with my bees. So then I got I got half a dozen or so, 8 beekeeping courses where I went to NPL to go and look after bees and get taught how to do it, which was absolutely invaluable. I suppose in a way that's an early introduction to serendipity, because essentially, I've got the book, I'm in the right place to find the bees, the school will let me set up a beekeeping club, I accidentally go to NPL. That NPL stuff exposes me to things that I'm going to be working through for the rest of my life, actually, with the stuff I described. And then I meet somebody by accident who then allows me to actually be successful at the beekeeping. I mean,
This is just your whole life, isn't it? And we will talk about the book in a little while. And, your whole life has been serendipitous, or maybe you're just more aware of it, I don't know, but there's just these fascinating chains of events that it's crazy, it's mad. So worms, bees, I don't know what other insects or mammals we've got next, but I know that because you lived in southwest London, you weren't far from Richmond Park.
Yep.
And there were some rockets, some explosives.
You can't do that these days.
So you can't do it these days. Some cameras on kites that one could describe as an early drone. David, what didn't you get up to on Richmond Park?
Well, the thing about the rockets was we had this rocket club and we were rather interested in explosives. Well, not explosives actually, because I wasn't keen on explosives. What I was keen on was trying to understand how rockets worked, and there's a thing called specific impulse, which is the rate of thrust compared to the weight, and learn a whole load of stuff like that. In those days, you had to go to the library and look these things up in books, and it was like looking through a keyhole. These days, of course, you can find out a lot more very quickly. But it was good. It was good training about how to build rockets and we made one which was a cardboard tube that you used to wrap carpet round and launch that. I'm sure I'm out of time for any prosecution. We launched it. We launched it in Richmond Park at the dead of night, and only after it had ignited did I begin to think, because this is what you're like as an adolescent. You don't think things through. after it ignited, I began to think, what would happen if it came down on somebody's roof? Now, this thing was 12 feet tall.
Yeah.
You know, it was a big object. Fortunately, we weren't good at rocketry, so it lifted off the ground, got a few feet off the ground, and then toppled over and burned itself out, which was great.
And then you built a camera for a kite, didn't you?
Yeah, we were going on a biology field trip, and to be honest, I thought, well, it's very interesting. I mean, you know, biology is very interesting. I always liked it, but I did find it a bit painting by numbers when you were doing it at O level and so on, and that kind of level, and it was, you know, learning by rote, and it doesn't appeal to me. So rather than counting the species in these meter squares, I thought, how could you actually take photographs of the entire area so you would then get a picture of what the biota were, and then be able to use that as part of, together with the meter square counting that was going on, to then describe the environment as part of the biology trip. So I designed with a couple of other people, but quite honestly, in the end, it was mostly me. I think in this case, a camera on a kite where you lit a fuse and then trigger the camera, right? And because we'd been doing rockets, of course, and then so you had to get the kite up with the fuse lit and then get the camera into position so that it would take the ring up. Of course, none of it worked on the day, because again, what you learn, or you learn later in life, is you need to prototype and iterate and do it several times. It's not going to work when you just try it on the day. So, but it was a good exercise.
Definitely.
It was a good exercise. And you're right, it was an early attempt to do a drone, because you couldn't there was no other way of getting an aerial photograph of the site where we were doing this measurement. And it would, had it worked, it would have been useful, I think, because you would have been able to then say, well, this is where these squares were.
Well, I'm very pleased that, you know, through your childhood, David, that you didn't end up in a juvenile detention centre.
These days, do not do this at home anymore.
So, back to another sort of serendipitous chance encounter now. You're at school, you're walking down the corridor, your career master says, what are you doing in your free period? Cleevely, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're not making rockets, you're not making drones. What was this all about?
Well, he'd arranged for somebody from Post Office Telecommunications, which then became BT later on, but Post Office Telecommunications to come along and talk about their sponsorship of students at university. So, completely by chance, I was going down the corridor and I went into this presentation. I thought, that looks interesting. I didn't think of myself as an engineer. I originally actually thought about doing biology, but I didn't do very well at O-level biology. And I did maths, physics and chemistry in the end, and that was actually pretty well the kind of thing they were looking for. And I, together with several hundred others, applied for this scheme, which we did a year before university, and I did 3 years at university, and I got paid for doing it, which was great. But the year before university was very varied and interesting. Had I not walked into that room and met that guy and got the leaflet, well, life would have been very different.
So it was really, the training that you were on for this course sounds fascinating, and a real variation of climbing up telegraph poles and all sorts of things. Can you tell us a bit more about that, David?
Yeah, again, you know, looking back on it, you kind of marvel that you did this stuff. But in that year, I did a whole load of stuff where I went out with gangs into the streets and, you know, digging stuff up in telegraph poles and in telephone exchanges and understanding how all that stuff works on a practical level. At another practical level, I learned how to operate a lathe, and my project was making a steam engine. So I actually built a complete steam engine, which just about worked. I made an analog computer, and that was very interesting for teaching me about simulation and so on. And we learned all sorts of theoretical stuff. Like, you know, my first first introduction to special relativity was learning special relativity in that year, along with a whole load of other bits of maths. So that by the time I actually went to university, I was going, well, this is a bit simple. Do you want a Bicky?
Yes, please.
There you go.
Thank you. So you'll now see on the screen that we've been brought some refreshments, very nice biscuits, and Munslow's getting in on the action as well.
I hope not.
Yeah, we'll keep these for ourselves, Munslow. So after the training, the climbing up telegraph poles, the steam engines, the analogue computers, all of that fascinating stuff. Wow, you've got some skills. You went to Reading University, didn't you, to study, was it cybernetics?
Basically, I'd always been rather interested in going to libraries and bookshops and things. And there was a bookshop in Richmond, and I used to just, on a Saturday morning, just go up there and just take a look through the books and see what was what. And there was a book by a chap called 𝗕𝗶𝘀𝗶𝘀𝗰 called Cybernetics, and there was this picture of this white-haired, bearded chap writing at a blackboard with chalk. And I flicked through it and I thought, this is rather interesting. It was about control theory, basically. Cybernetics has kind of moved its meaning. Like so many words in the English language, it starts off with one thing and then moves into something else. And it's moved because of the necromancer William Gibson's book and cyberspace and so on, which then shifted what it really means. Kybernetes in Greek is about a steersman, it's an oarsman, so it is about control theory, and so that was the original intention. So I was very fascinated by the idea that you could control things, and you could control mechanical systems, so you could build robots and do things like that. But I was also interested in the way that you could control other systems, like economic systems and so on, and that really fascinated me.
How did you find yourself in Cambridge?
Well, because I'd been sponsored by Post Office Telecommunications, and I did a stint at what was called the Long Range Studies Division. And the Long Range Studies Division was originally based down in London and then moved up to Cambridge. Now, the Long Range Studies Division was the bit of the Post Office Telecommunications that was looking ahead about 20 or 30 years, trying to see where things were going, feeding stuff back for strategy. And so that really attracted me because it was a wonderful opportunity to start to look into the future. Sadly, of course, all of that is now in the past.
Yeah. And that was down Hills Road, wasn't it?
88 Hills Road, yes, I remember it very well.
So that brought you to Cambridge, and then you spent your time there at the Long Range
Studies Division. So the point was, so I looked at some interesting things. I mean, you've got to go back in time to when virtually dinosaurs were ruling the planet, as my kids would say. Basically, there were no mobile phones.
Yeah.
So I worked on one of the first papers about mobile telephony, and it was based around CB radio.
Yeah, I remember that.
CB radio.
I'm old too.
I said, look, there's a latent demand here for people really would like to wander around with devices that they could talk to other people using. I had the chap who the security classification for this was the existence of this paper should not be acknowledged to anybody, right? And then later on, I learned that one of the heads of marketing, a very senior guy in BT, had claimed it as entirely his own work.
Wow.
That was a great introduction to corporate life. Another thing I looked at was there was this move from analog switching in telecoms to digital. And so you had to think, well, these new components were coming along, how would the price change? So I looked at the price change and I read Moore's book and I said, well, the price is going to go down 30, 40, 50, 60% a year. The chap came up from London, was a bit surprised. He said, look, all the other experts say the price decreases are going to be 3, 4, 5, 8% a year. You're talking about numbers that don't just go down by 30% or 50% a year, they keep on going. He said, do you realise you're going to be able to store an entire page of A4 for less than a penny, or less than 0.1 of a penny. By the way, that one page of A4 is something like, let me do the calculation, 1 0 2 zeros 500 times smaller than a standard photograph that you take on your iPhone, right? And how many photographs have you got, or on your Android? How many photographs have you got on your phone?
A lot.
Right, and do you think that costs as little as 1.1 of a penny? It's costing 1,000 times less than that, right? Or 100,000 times less than that. He couldn't imagine that what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And so they asked me to leave the expert panel because my estimates were so far away from what the other experts said. Now, I think I was right, as we've seen, as what's happened. I mean, you're holding a bit of electronics there.
Yep.
That would have cost half the UK GDP back then, right? So that taught me another thing about corporate life, which is that it really doesn't like outliers. And what was the ironic thing was that the whole of the UK digital switching fabric, all the architecture, was designed around what these experts said. And that taught me something about experts.
So you did your PhD here at Cambridge, didn't you? And then after that, your career escalated really quickly. So from working from post office or post office telecoms or British telecom as it was then known, you were very quickly in director and board level roles.
So what happened was, because I was doing this stuff with the long range search division, then I came in contact with some people at the University of Cambridge, and then I was really, my wife said, you need to do a PhD. She's always right. And so I looked at two possibilities. One was optimal control of the British economy, which I felt a little bit uncertain about. I didn't think it was possible to do this kind of thing in economics, but I didn't know why. And the other one was something which became a bit of a passion for me, which was to demonstrate that telecommunications was important for economic development. Now again, it's very difficult to look at this now and imagine that in those days, people didn't think telecommunications was necessarily important for economic development, right? Bit of a weird thing to say, and I suppose it marks a lot of my career. I see things and get somewhat impatient with everybody else because they don't quite see where things are going. But
yeah.
So I then did the PhD on Kenya and did some work with the World Bank. Went over to Washington a couple of times and contributed to that. And then used that, because that was part of a network of people who were working in this kind of area, to then join a group which had just started at the Economist Intelligence Unit, and I was a senior consultant there, and then I became director of the telecommunications division and did a whole load of projects there, and then decided that, right, it was time I did my own company, because I'd read the Cambridge phenomenon and got very impressed with what was going on in Cambridge, and decided that the best thing to do would be to have a consultancy company in telecommunications. And I managed to kind of rent a little place from a friend of mine who got some premises up on the Science Park. So then I had a Science Park address doing telecommunications consultancy.
And when would that have been? Was that kind of late 70s, early 80s at that point?
No, that's mid-80s.
Mid-80s.
We're now mid-80s. I've taken us fast forward through my PhD, which goes from the late 70s into the early 80s, Economist Intelligence Unit, and then into the middle 80s, starting my own company.
Yeah, middle 80s on the Science Park. Wow. So what we could do, we could go through all of your career, which would probably mean we'll still be recording this at Christmas. We've gone through quite a few SD cards. We can't do that. Look at David's LinkedIn profile. It's got his whole work career on there. But what I'd like to do is probably talk about one of the ones you're best known for, and that's Abcam.
All right.
If that's okay. And obviously that is another bit of serendipity there, because you were out having dinner, weren't you? And that's where you met Jonathan Milner.
So we need to let's put all of this into the kind of the context, right? So I'd started my company in '85. I'd managed to get it to be pretty successful, and so by the kind of the mid-90s, so 10 years later, 12 years later, it was a successful company. And I was then beginning to bump into people in Cambridge, and we were starting things like the Cambridge Network.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things were going on, and I was beginning to think, right, there's some possibilities here. I was, for example, within Analysis, my consultancy company, I'd been developing web applications for second-hand cars and for selling houses and doing all sorts of things like this, right? A whole load of bits and pieces. So there was this preparation that had gone on, but I didn't know what it was going to get applied to. And then through my wife, who was working with Jonathan's now wife at an art gallery, I went to a dinner, sat next to Jonathan, and here's the other thing that's important. I was curious. I talked to Jonathan about what he was doing and about the work he was doing on breast cancer. Then he explained that he was very frustrated about antibodies and the fact that antibodies he was using in his experiments were expensive and they didn't work. And he wanted to sort that out. And he wanted to sort that out, it transpired that one of his co-workers had got an uncle who got a farm in Wales, and he wanted to raise goats to be able to then create antibodies to then be able to sell them. Now, that chance encounter has a whole series of things in it about why this was going to work, right? So I knew enough about biology to know about antibodies. I knew enough about the business models to know that doing a goat farm really wasn't the way to do it. And I'd done this preparatory work on web development, so I knew the economics of the web stuff. And I'd been thinking about an idea, and there we had it. It was, and literally in that dinner, I calculated how much it would cost to produce an antibody, and the difference between and how much it would cost to sell it. And the margin was 80-85%, something like that.
And you did that while you were eating your dinner?
Yes, yeah.
Asking for another gravy boat to be filled, and you calculator at the same time.
Something like that. How did you know I like gravy? But the thing was that the number that I calculated was some 4 or 5 years later the actual number that it cost to produce an antibody as far as Abcam was concerned, right? So that, but that was because I'd done this consultancy work. So I'd been trained in doing this as a telecoms consultant, doing the economics of technology. You have to do this stuff really quickly. Have to do the calculations in your head. You have to think through the business models, and so you have to have this picture of how the system is going to work.
Yeah.
So it was a perfect match. There's Jonathan with all that domain expertise, understanding what the market needed. Here's me with the technology and all the bits that underpin it. Mm-hmm. Absolutely perfect. Couldn't be better serendipity if you planned it.
It wasn't Amazon for antibodies, wasn't it? Abcam. And humble beginnings in a very tiny little lab or a room, wasn't it?
A room probably about the size of this, actually.
Yeah.
And nothing like as nice.
This has been part 1 of our conversation with David, and if you'd like to watch part 2, keep a lookout for it soon.